Hey there, and welcome to our painting lesson of... There's no canvas over there. A seascape. We have a beautiful beach, waves rolling in. There's that sparkle coming through on the water, and it's a lot of fun. But what makes today extremely special is the fact that we are going to be doing it with, for the first time, my official brush set. These launch tomorrow, August 28th at 11 a.m. EST. And if you want to get notified when they do drop so you can ensure that you do pick them up before they potentially sell out, there will be a link in the video description to the Craftamo site. You just put your email in there and then you'll get an email saying the brushes are live tomorrow at 11 a.m. EST. So I am extremely excited to demo this set here for you today. It is entirely cruelty free. It is a vegan set. I customized all of the brushes to work very specifically well with the lessons that we do here on the channel. All of the videos that we do on the channel from here on out will be done with this set of brushes. So if you want to ensure that you're working with exactly what I'm using, you can pick them up. And again, it's really exciting. We've been working on this for the majority of 2022. You've seen me render a lot of paintings using different samples that we've had, and the brushes have gone through different refinements. For instance, right now we have the fan brush, and it is a stiff bristled fan brush, but it isn't that stiff, and if you get it wet, it essentially acts in clumps as more of a soft bristled fan brush. So you don't need to alternate back and forth between two fan brushes like we did back in 2021 here on the channel. Additionally, we have the rigger brush, which we extended the bristles of so it can hold more water. You can do more elongated strokes for randomized applications, great for things like grass in the foreground. But we also have two flat-headed brushes in the set. One is larger, great for washes, blocking things in, but the corners are sharp, so great for detail. And then the other one is very specifically chosen for detail, but also it's good at blending, and it's very versatile. It is like the brush you'll go to if you're working on a cityscape. We use it quite a lot here today, actually. And on top of that, there is a Filbert brush in what I consider the absolute perfect size for a Filbert brush, especially when rendering clouds. Again, something we'll do here today with the lesson. So that is what we are working with in terms of our brushes. All of the other materials will be listed in the video description. Again, in the description, you can also find the Craftamo site where you can sign up to get the brushes. And in the description, you can also find the traceable up over on Patreon if you'd like help with the drawing process. There's also the reference photo, all of my ebooks, and all of that fun stuff. So if you're interested, the description is a very lively place with information and links to help you on your creative journey. But let's do a brush demo here, real time. Let's paint that seascape and let's have a great time. So we're going to begin here today with the large flat-headed brush. This one is a 10, and we'll dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will condense the bristles and help keep our paint wet for a little bit longer. With that, we're going to head to our palette, grab an abundance of titanium white, grab a small amount of our ultramarine blue using the corner of our brush. Then we'll proceed to desaturate it using the smallest hint of a Mars black. We can barely see it, and you know what? I might even take off the excess right there. Work that in, and it's just a very strong pigment, so we need to be careful. And then, once it's fully mixed and we don't have little areas of blue, little areas of white or black, we'll head to the only open area of sky within this piece. And as you can see, we'll just very quickly layer this on. If we go over it softly with our brush and we move horizontally, typically you can do so without rendering any streaks. It's only when you apply a lot of pressure that you get those markings. So we'll just do a couple layers, make sure it's nice and thick, and we'll let that dry before we work on the clouds to the left and right. However, as we let that dry, we can start the mixing process for our clouds. And what we're essentially going to do is we're going to start in the back and work our way forwards. That way we're always applying the clouds in the foreground over clouds in the background, and it'll just be a really easy way to create that depth. Now we're going to continue working with the flat-headed brush. We're going to take, yet again, an abundance of titanium white. This is probably double the amount of pigment as what we currently have in our mixture, and I'm going to put that in there. This is going to give us something that's cohesive with what we just applied, while also creating a nice bright cloud color so it looks like the light is really shining through. And we're going to begin by applying it around our previous cloud, or opening of the clouds rather. And then once I have it essentially surrounded, we can start moving in. And we don't move in beforehand because we don't want to dilute this pigment with this pigment. But now that we're there, we're going to use the sharp edge of the brush, and we can just tap in this transition area. And you can softly use the edge of the brush to soften it. Now, some of these markings are going to be a little bit sharper. Some of them can be softer, depending upon if you want to blend and go over it a couple times. Here is an example, just soft blends. You can see how it works its way up until we cover the corner. Now, I'm just going to quickly clean off my brush a little bit so that I don't have the darker blue here diluting what I'm working with in here. So just a little bit of time spent in the water and back to the palette. Now, as we proceed outwards, this is going to get a little bit darker because it's this top opening area of the cloud that's the thinnest and will allow the most light through. As we get farther down, less of that occurs. So what we're going to do is actually not start with a darker mixture, but remix what we already have, because typically just doing a little edit is better than starting fresh, because then you can really see how it's changing. And I always try to leave a little bit of the previous mix right to the left or right. That way I can use it to ensure that the new version is the same. So just mix that up. And again, this is a fantastic brush for mixing because you can get so much paint moved around and condensed. With that, again, we go a little bit darker, and I'm not going to go to the blue initially to do so. I'm going to go with the Mars Black. It will desaturate this a little bit. It's not a bad thing. And then maybe a little bit of blue. But you can see I'm just using the corner. I'm not using the entirety of the brush. Having that nice sharp little corner is quite useful. And now I'm going to head over to the side, head in here. There's essentially a couple larger clouds through here that we're avoiding temporarily. And over here. Now there's also this pigment in grand abundance towards the bottom, and when you apply more pressure with this brush, as you can see, it really expands, cover a lot of surface area quickly. And initially, you can see that my brush strokes are kind of all over the place. Sometimes they're horizontal, sometimes they're vertical. There is a lot of diversity in their application. However, as you will soon see, we will go over it with a horizontal soft stroke. It will soften and make it uniform. Now we go back up to the top, and it should still be wet because we made sure our brush was damp. And then using an X-shaped pattern, we'll softly blend into the previous clouds, just like this. You get a little bit of pattern or texture, it's also okay, because it'll just look like the clouds have volume. See that? Beautiful. Easy. Now, I do want a bit more of a transition, so I'm going to brighten it up slightly, add that titanium white. I also want to build up my layers. Often your first layer isn't going to be the best layer, and the more attempts you take at it, the better it will get. There we go. I'm also fine with covering portions of the other clouds. It's no issue. Working with these pigments in abundance. And the thicker you get it, typically, the more professional it will look in the end. So now we're going to start moving to the clouds that are a little bit more in the foreground, but we're starting with this one because this is in front of that. And again, we work from the back forwards. Now with this, we're going to get something quite a bit darker. So we'll take our Mars Black, take off the excess, slowly interject that into the current mixture that we have. And as you can see, just adding a little bit can have a very dramatic effect. We'll grab slightly more of that blue, reinstigate the hue in it, and we'll brighten it up slightly. We can always darken, and it's easier to darken than lighten with acrylic painting. So now, we'll start heading in, and I'm going to work around the implied cloud right here, but then as we start to get upwards, I'm going to essentially just fill in the body of where I want this cloud to be, because we're not actually going to apply the majority of it with this brush. We are going to take that brush, put it down, and switch over to the Filbert. And this one is a 5, fantastic brush for clouds because it has these rounded edges, great for soft blends, but it also has that sharper top, which means you can add some real form should you want to. Very versatile. So I'm going to make sure it's nice and damp, that way the bristles are condensed, and we'll go back up, we'll grab some paint, and I'll show you how we work with this. So we're going to expand on this darker cloud around the edges, and we're just using the edge of this brush, feather it out so that we get this softer marking like that. And we're painting wet into dry right now, so it can't be entirely soft, but you get a little bit of a gradient, right? You don't have a hard edge, but if you want a hard edge like this, and I do, right up here to a point, we can render that. We can also create a bit of a harder edge towards the bottom, and then have little portions of the cloud which kind of sneak out and create little offshoots. And these are all unique little pieces that are going to give the cloud personality and stand out from the other ones. So you can see that I'm continuously going back, layering the middle so that it's nice and thick, but then keeping the edges a bit more thin. Something else we can do is we can take titanium white, ultramarine blue, minimal amount, Mars Black, minimal amount. We can remix this right beside our current mixture, and you can see that I still have a little bit of my cloud color there, very intentionally for reference, and we can actually paint wet into wet here. And this can create a truly soft blend. Some people prefer wet into dry, some people prefer wet into wet. I, personally, like both, to be honest. I think that they each have a place in most paintings. But here, I'm opting for something slightly softer because I don't want this cloud to be too distracting. It's a bit more in the distance, right? And I want it to feel like it's sinking into that distance. Again, we soften those edges, just like so. Nice and easy. Our brush is a little bit diluted right now, so we're picking up darker pigment and moving it around to a greater degree than we normally would. But I'm okay with that because it's just adding different volume to the clouds. And I'm also making this edge a little bit brighter as we work our way in so that it doesn't feel like a flat silhouette. Cloud kind of gets lost to a degree over there. There we go. Soft. Beautiful. And you can see that there are still some hard lines from the top of the brush, but softer blends using the corners. And I think this is slightly better as it begins to dry a little bit, so you can wait. But if you have darker areas that you really want to lighten, again, we go in with something that is even lighter than what we have back there because we need to compensate for the dark pigment that's right there. And acrylic paints are inherently semi-transparent and darker pigments are typically stronger. So we just need to essentially come prepared, but we can cut into these clouds and give them more unique shapes if, in the process, they expand to a greater degree than what we actually want. And again, this is what's going to make it all very unique. There we go. It looks a little bit messy now, but as we get more clouds, it'll feel cohesive. And so much of painting, as you've heard me note before, is about having faith in the process. Recognizing that right now, it might not be exactly what you want, but you are working towards something. And if you have that vision and you see it through, you'll get exactly what you want. So that's what we're doing. We're putting in the time, putting in the effort, having fun doing it, and we'll have something special. So with that, I'm quite happy at this point. We might go back to it depending upon how we balance, but we're going to move to this cloud. Now for it, we put our Filbert down. We go back to our 1-inch. We grab that darker mixture. And yet again, what do? We only apply it in the larger body of where we're going to want this cloud to be because we're using this brush exclusively to apply grand amounts of paint and not, at this point anyway, do any real modeling. There we go. We have an interesting shape. This can kind of jet out here. Maybe it ends up meeting a portion of a cloud over there. I'm also going to take the excess paint off this brush. That way it doesn't start to dry with it. Again, by making the brush damp, we can kind of extend the life of it and not worry about that too much, but something we should be mindful of. Now we'll grab the brighter pigment, and I actually want this side of the cloud to be a bit brighter. So I'm just going to lead with it. Try to get as little contact with this as possible. And then I'll do the blend into it once I've done the entirety of that edge. And I'll go for a soft blend, lots of tapping. Very little pressure is being used in these applications. I think that's very important. There we go. I want to soften these edges. I'm not applying a lot of pressure with my brush. Just letting the water on the brush make the pigment semi-transparent as we expand. Then I definitely want to soften the transition from this cloud into this one. So we'll go in yet again with this. There we go. Love that. We can definitely build our highlights and the edge of this cloud. Make it look quite a bit more three-dimensional than it currently does. Remember, if we don't have a brighter or darker side, it'll probably adopt that of a silhouetted look. That's not a bad thing, but it's not what we're going for. So we'll continue to expand upon the transition of light from the right-hand side down into the left and bottom of what we have here. Remember, this side was brighter and it moved to the darker. This side is brighter, moves to the darker side. Same idea. A lot of very meticulous modeling, which is something I love about this brush. Again, we can get those soft blends, but when you want those sharp markings, we have them as well. There we go. I might expand this darker area to the bottom with actually darker pigment. But it's really going back and forth, doing the dance, until we have something that we really care about. There we go. Okay. Now, brighter. I know we're spending a lot of time here, but I think it's important to stress just the fact that patience pays off. There we go. We can make this area brighter to accentuate the darker bottom portion. And we can definitely do a lot more in terms of building this out, but I don't want to overdo it because I don't want to force myself to overdo this area. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a bit of a break from this. We can go back and model it to a greater degree after, but for now, we move up here. Now we'll jump into the larger cloud to the top left-hand corner, again, utilizing the flat-headed brush. We'll apply the majority of this darker pigment to the left-hand side, leaving a little bit of room here between the canvas and the blue backdrop. Go back, grab a little bit of water. And the water really does help us spread the pigment, ensure that we're applying it smoothly, but again, it does also thin it to a rather large degree. So do be aware that if you're using an excessive amount of water, it's likely you are going to have to you are going to have to do a couple of layers. Sometimes the ideas spark as you're painting and you have to stop talking because you have to figure it out. There we go. So again, very basic base as intended. Now, what do? We switch over to the Filbert, make sure it too is nice and damp. We will mix up a brighter variant similar to that of the sky. You can see I have a new abundance of titanium white on my palette. We will be using a lot of that in this lesson. And here, we'll just start working this in, creating a separation between these two. I'll also start working it up. We don't want this to just be a straight line. I want it to be significantly more interesting than that. And here you can see I'm keeping the bottom of a lot of these markings sharper so that it looks like this area of the cloud is a little bit more pronounced where the light is working its way around this, and it just gives us a different way of working with depth. And I'm doing a lot of blending inwards, trying to create this larger gradient, trying to show that the center of the cloud is a lot thicker and therefore the light can't move through it to the same degree as the edges. Lots of Small brush strokes with very little pressure. But this is a subject where if you do leave, there's brush strokes. Typically it actually looks quite nice. Just gives you a bit more of a complicated cloud, which isn't a bad thing. But it's also something that you should know that you want, right? Because it's not a bad thing, but it also might not be a good thing, or it might not be exactly what you want. It's just that process of staying mindful of that which you're creating. Because you can make anything you want. You just have to picture it and take the right steps. And probably take the right steps many a time. Because it is a trial of patience and learning. As I do this, you know what? I realize that I actually don't really want the hard edge. Again, the point stands. We can do what we want. We just have to know what it is. So let's soften it. The same way we did the top. Let's go in with a bit of a darker pigment here. You can see I'm just working back and forth between the bright and the dark, wet into wet. I think that's quite nice actually. Apologies for the sounds. I have portions of my easel out so I can rest my palette or reference photo, phone with my reference photo. Typically like to print out the reference photo so that I can test directly on it. But I also like to have it on my phone so that I have a very clear view of it. And as per usual, you can find the reference photo along with the traceable and the ebooks and the private Facebook group and all that good stuff up over on Patreon. But you can also just find the reference photo in the video description. I like to keep it easy. Here, I don't see it in the reference photo, but I like the idea of kind of separating these highlights a little bit. I think it gave us a neat look. Create a little bit more separation. There we go. Build additional highlight into it. Just like that. Back up to the top. Incredibly soft. This is wet into dry, but there's so little pigment on the brush. It's a lot of water. And I'll do this in a couple of areas throughout to render these really soft markings. And that way they'll be nice and cohesive throughout the piece. Just as you've seen. I also want this bottom area to be a bit of a darker cloud. So I'm going to grab this. And this will be far too dark, admittedly, initially. But we'll balance it. Also, you can see that I'm using this brush rather than the 1-inch. It's just because I already have that paint loaded. The 1-inch would be more convenient for filling that in. Said, let's remix the rough color of the sky. It's a little bit too blue. Work a bit of titanium white and Mars black back in there. Not too darken or brighten, but just to desaturate. And that's perfect. And now we'll blend that into that darker pigment we just applied. Give us the implication of clouds on the horizon. Might use this to also soften the bottom of this cloud. Go back to the darker pigment. Continue to build this out. If you want it to be more prominent. If not, it's okay. Personal preference. So much of painting is subjective. And just because I have it a certain way doesn't need to mean that you need to make it a certain way. It can be your own, it can be unique, it can be individual. And that's all right. There we go. Now I also want to interject a little bit of that sky and that brightness right up through here. So we'll do a bit of a blend. Down and around. And we grab more highlight. Because realistically, all of that just blended with the darker pigment and we're not actually getting the color of the sky, which is okay. It can be a bit of a blend, a bit of an amalgamation, but I do want something a bit brighter. And then we'll try to put some unique little flares into it so that it doesn't have just a singular look and movement, right? And this is where the paintings start to look a whole lot better. Okay. Back to the mix. There we go. Now, for the first time, we are going to switch to the rigger, otherwise known as the liner brush, and this is something that I really wanted in the set because we needed that finite detail, which couldn't really be achieved with a flat-headed brush, right? It has very long bristles, sticks well together, we want to make sure it's nice and damp, and we're going to create a very similar pigment to that. Typically, this isn't a brush you do a lot of mixing with, but we don't need a grand abundance of it, so it'll actually do quite nice. With that, to remix, here you can see I'm essentially just putting my palette up to the canvas. We'll do a little test inside. Brilliant. And now I'm going to take this pigment, because this is cloud with a lot of light, and I'm going to very purposefully apply this to the cloud right in here, build up some extra depth. Again, I didn't want to do it initially because I didn't want to start fighting with the balance of the painting before it was really established. And we can do subtle blends. I'm just using the edge of the brush like I did with a Filbert to soften, but I'm using the tip of it to render these nice sharp markings. And we're just building up that highlight minorly. There's a fair bit of water on the brush, which means it's semi-transparent. There we go. Lovely. We can also work this in between some of our other clouds by blending out both of the edges. And it'll look like there's this beautiful opening happening within there. It's quite dramatic, but in a good way. I'm also going to take this, and we essentially have this larger cloud which is in front of this one, right? And it's a bit more dense, but it should have little shelves that come out and also collect light. So we're going to paint those on to a point, and I like to make the top a bit sharper, and then I blend down the bottom, as you can see here. And we're just working this around the darker clouds, which we've already established. We are working on a cloud behind them, so we're kind of breaking our rule a little bit. But those rules are meant to guide you and help you in general, not handcuff you to painting in a very particular way. There we go. Down here, I might do a little bit more blending of both the top and the bottom because I don't want it to be too stark in such an open area. By using lots of water, you don't get an extremely dramatic initial effect. So you can build it up over time, which is something I really appreciate. It's not an overcommitment, but you put in that time and you really figure it out. And then it's so much more special for it. There we go. Lovely. So you can see we're really building some depth. I think we want to do a little bit over here, just towards the cloud, and let it dissipate down. I'm also, as you can see, when I blend and I want to really expand my stroke, I take my brush, I press in, so then I use essentially 5 times the amount of space, and I can get this little glaze going, which we will have fun with in just a second, but we do need to let our painting dry, and then I'll show you how we can apply a glaze and make some dramatic changes or soft changes should we want to. But I really like our clouds, and I think we are ready to start finalizing portions of the sky. Now, for the next step, we need to ensure that the sky is fully dried at the touch, and this is very specifically for people who want to alter the value, so how light or dark the sky is, or the general hue of it, so the color. We can do either of them, and we're going to do them with the flat-headed brush. Again, this is the larger one, it's the 10, and we're going to do a glaze. So, you don't have to do this if you're very happy with your sky, but if you do want to change it, this is how you do so. I'm going to take a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of my blue, because I want my sky to be a bit brighter, very specifically my clouds and the darker values in them, and I want them to be slightly more blue. So I'm mixing up a whitish blue mixture. But I can't just take this and apply it over top, or I'll hinder all of the line work and the design within it. So I'm going to grab some water with my brush, really thin out the pigment that I have, so it's almost like working with a watercolor. And then I'm going to apply that over the entirety of the sky. That way it's nice and cohesive. And you can see it didn't change too much, but there was a slight change. Now, yet again, blue, titanium white, and a lot of water. And every time we do this, we'll be bringing the values closer together. In this case, closer to more of a brighter value. I'm not changing the actual hue greatly. It's a little bit more blue, but not to a massive degree. And just like that, I think it made a really nice difference. Again, you don't have to do it. You can do it to a much greater degree, a much lesser degree, but it's a tool in your belt. Also, I think I actually want to make the sky a little bit more blue. So we'll go back with this brush, and this is just to show you that even if we're working back to forward, we can go back and make changes. We just have to be mindful of how we do so. So this is a bit more blue. Using the brush to tap into the other clouds, just like so. Now I'm going to take the remainder of the pigment off of that brush, put it down, switch to the Filbert, mix up a nice pigment that is very similar to that of the initial clouds, the very bright ones. Do believe they had a hint of Mars black, but not much. We'll do a test. Looks great. Apply it initially all the way around before we touch the actual blue. Do a nice soft blend into the previous mixture, that way we know that it's cohesive. And then we do the wet into wet blends that we previously created this with. Softening those edges gives it a really friendly look. And notice how all of these cut-ins aren't the same. They vary pretty dramatically, and intentionally so. We even have a little bit of a gradient in general leading out to them. There we are. And then some little pieces of clouds. But I really love that. So now that we're happy with the sky, we're going to start moving on to the distant land in the background. We are going back to the flat-headed brush. And for this, I'm going to start, as we typically do, with some titanium white. And we're going to look for a pigment that's a bit darker than this, but also a bit more desaturated, though we still want our blue. So I'll grab the blue, I'll grab Mars black, we'll mix right beside so that we know that we are going to get something nice and similar, but I also don't want it to be too dark because we want to save our higher contrasts for the foreground. This is getting a lot of reflective atmospheric light, and we want it to be something much more akin to that. So now I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground it on the canvas to eliminate shape from my hand, and we'll start placing in this distant landmass. I'm not going across straight with the brush, I'm weaving in and out. That way we get a unique top to it. We'll go into a bit of a dive. It'll come back up. And when you're painting distant land, often it's done in a silhouette. So it's really important that you keep in mind the subtleties of shape that you can incorporate, because they will make a massive difference in rendering something you actually really like. With that, once we have the top done, we're going to work our way down. Just going to grab a bit more water. Cut along the tops of the water that is yet to be implemented. And it's not going to go too far because we're going to have a wave that's covering it right through here. It's also probably best to do a couple of layers just to make sure it's nice and thick. Now, once our distant land masses are fully dry to the touch, we are going to continue using the flat-headed brush. We'll make sure it's nice and damp, and for the first time, we'll look at turquoise green here on our palette. Now, this is going to be for the real waves in the center here, and despite this being a seascape, the majority of the sky and the majority of the sand actually take up the majority of the piece. So we don't actually have a lot of water, and that's why this little strip of water can be much more saturated, much more lively. It won't be overwhelming, and it'll really add this beautiful center to what we're working towards with a more muted palette on the top and the bottom. So with that, we'll grab our turquoise green, we'll brighten it with about an equal mixture of titanium white. This will also thicken it nicely. We'll need to desaturate it a little bit because we don't want it to look artificial within our pre-existing very natural pigments. And Mars Black, while it desaturated it, it also darkened it. So we are going to go back to more titanium white, which will brighten it, but also desaturate it slightly more. However, as you can see, this in relation to everything else is still rather quite saturated. I'm going to do a little test on my reference photo. Looks quite nice. Might be able to go a little bit brighter. Again, just titanium white. And now we can start working this in. I'm going to use the sharp top of this brush to create some definitive line work. And Again, this brush is fantastic for blocking things in, but it's also wonderful for larger detail, much like what we are currently accomplishing. Also, you can see that a lot of this is done in smaller but intentional strokes rather than a singular elongated one. That way the waves have motion. Now we can start working this down, but we're not going to work it too far. And there is a larger wave right here that we will avoid to a point. It'll have a lot of splashing water which will overlap what we're currently painting, but that'll just make this beautiful color a bit more elusive. That's not a bad thing. I'm just refining some of the tops, and then we start to move it down here, covering up a large portion of the drawing, admittedly and intentionally. Get a lot of questions as to why I do the drawing if I'm just going to paint over it. Fair question. I find often doing the drawing once, twice, 3 times, it makes me so much better at actually painting it. So I'm going to cover it up, I'm going to re-sketch it using Conte, and I feel like my painting will be a lot better for it. And that's just a typical process that I like to go through. Takes a little bit more time, but it gives me a better understanding of the subject that I'm working with, and I find it very much worth it. That said, we're working this down, and then you know what we're doing? We're transitioning it. So, it's time for sand. We're going to be using the same brush. We're going to be covering more of the drawing, and we're going to be doing so right now while that is still wet. Now here, I actually have a raw umber, very nice and muted, great for beach scenes. We're going to make it very bright, a lot of titanium white. We'll also desaturate it with a hint of Mars Black. You can see that a bit of our turquoise green is also working its way in there. Not a concern, it's just going to make it more cohesive. And I need a lot of this pigment. Grand amount. So I'm just going to keep mixing. We also want to leave room to brighten it slightly, and I think we're there. So from there, I'm going to start applying this right through here. If I skip one area of the sand, it'll be this, just because it's very definitive in that it's foam, and it kind of gives me a nice separating point in the painting. So I don't have to worry about covering all of this before I handle this transition up here. As per usual, we're going to get as close as we can without having them touch. I'm going to soften the sand by going over it with horizontal soft strokes. I just looked back at the camera and realized you don't see the very bottom. However, fear not, you aren't missing anything. It's very basic. That said, we need more paint. So more paint we mix. I'm going to do another quick layer here. Build it up before we incorporate the green. And now we go for the transition. And here I'm going to use an X-shaped pattern, so my brush is moving back and forth, as you can see, very intentionally. And then horizontally I'll work up. And then I'll work down. And all of this is going to be covered by foam and waves, but we'll see little hints of it showing through, and it'll look really nice. There we go. We can also go back to this mix, have them meet in the middle, and work back and forth until you have the perfect blend. So here you can see the bottom of the canvas, again just the very muted brown working its way up, and we'll take that and continue over on the right hand side, Again, we won't need a grand amount of it. Go over it a couple of times. And I think I actually need quite a bit more paint. So we'll go back to the mix, working it right in where we did the first time. Lots of titanium white, hint of Mars black, and I do mean a hint. There we go. We're painting a somewhat cloudy day. You'd expect the clouds to be out and then in and back and forth, and it's very much that here as well, which makes the painting process a little interesting because you're constantly playing with different lighting, but it's making me feel the atmosphere, which is fun. As I get up here, I'm going to make it slightly more of the turquoise green, but I'm also going to make it slightly darker. So we're going for a transition. Still want that brown to be prominent in the mix. And we want to make it gradual, so I'm not going to go for anything dramatic quickly. This looks great. Blend that down into the softer sand color. Work our way back up, eliminating streaks and strokes. It's amazing where all of our detail went in the drawing, isn't it? It's okay though, once this dries, I'll draw it back on, and it'll be nice and easy. There we go. This wave is going to have quite a bit of brown in it. It's picking up a lot of sand, and that's important to note because it means that it's very close to the shore, right? We'll have a wave back here, which is much more turquoise green, implies that it's really out there. This one helps reaffirm the amount of depth between us and the wave, and how far that one is as well by comparison. That said, I do want a little bit more of the turquoise green for the top of this one, and some extra titanium white. Might even move it over here just so we don't have to mix with a real abundance of paint. Much better. See that? It's really nice. So we can have a little bit of a gradient from the tealish brown into the regular raw umber. I think we'll double down on that actually. We're blending into wet paint, so we're not going to get exactly what we have on the palette or the brush. We're going to get an amalgamation of it and what's already on the canvas. There we go. Soft transitions downwards. But if we keep a couple brush strokes, it'll look like moving water, and it's not a bad thing. So my brush is essentially moving like this. Don't want to do too much. I'm already pushing more than what I see in the reference photo, but I think I'll really like it. Now we'll just do a little connective tissue. A lot of this is going to be covered by splashes, so it's not too relevant, but we might as well cover that area of canvas anyway, so we have something to build on top of. There we go. So as you can see, I've gone ahead and redrawn in a lot of the line work for the foam that's going to be coming off of the waves. And I did it with a Conte because you can take it off just so easily, a little bit of water or even just your finger. You can also allocate different colors to different subjects. It takes well to canvas that already has paint on it. So just very versatile in a lot of ways. But with that, we are going to start by painting some of the foam on here. I have my flat-headed brush, the large one still. We're going to grab an abundance of titanium white, a little bit of our Mars black, and we don't want the brightest pigment possible, but we also don't want anything darker. And then I'm also going to grab the smallest hint of ultramarine blue for the first time in a while, because I want that blue from the sky reflecting down into the foam just a little bit, just in the foreground. And now we can start applying this. I'm doing so in the open area of canvas because I know very definitively that we need to cover it. And then I'll start working the edges. You can see that I'm using the sharp edge of this brush to mold it to a point. We have a lot of definitive movements and you can see how it winds down, but there's these little pieces of foam that come out and it's rounded, right? So the top is higher up, then it moves down towards the bottom. Easy enough. And we'll expand out this way. If it's a little bit toothy, that's also okay, because if you get the sand showing through, you're essentially going to make it look like there are little openings within the foam, and it'll just add texture. Now, I'm going to be mindful of how we proceed, because we now need to work into smaller areas. And this brush is great for blocking, it's great for large blends, but it isn't ideal for a lot of small, intricate work. We can do some little markings like this, and you see that how it's always moving, flowing, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller. We want to do a lot of that, but there's going to become a point where this brush just can't achieve the detail that we want. So I'm moving it out to the best extent that I can, as you can see. We don't have to follow all of the lines of the Conte perfectly. If you feel inspired in the moment to create a different look, you can do that, because the Conte can come off very easily. But grab a little bit more water, fill in the larger area over here to the right hand side. Again, same idea, larger, blocky center, and then towards the sides, you have these little protruding pieces that come out and wrap down to the point where they touch the sand or the very thin layer of water which is over the sand. Just like that. Now we'll work it back up and over into here. Connect that. Start doing some connective pieces. It's one, it's two. Like with a lot of this, we want to go in initially and be a little bit apprehensive, a little conservative with our application. And then as we figure out the larger forms, we can really expand. But you can see how I'm trying to connect all of these little pieces with the larger pre-existing ones. Then we can add little portions in between, just moving with the general larger bodies of foam. Little taps, just using the corner, taking advantage of the versatility of the brush. But again, it's only so versatile. There comes a point, that point is now, where we need to switch brushes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pre-mix a bit more of that paint. This time, however, we're going to make it a bit darker. So more Mars Black as we start to move up. We'll also use a little bit of our turquoise green instead of the ultramarine blue, because we're moving in closer to that rather than the reflection of the sky. That'll be a great base. So I'm just going to get the majority of that off my brush and switch over for the first time to our smaller flat brush. This one is a 3. Great for detail work, can still pick up a good amount of paint. The corners are extremely sharp, and it'll be just what we need for this expansion. So, first we'll do a little bit of a blend down into the pre-existing foam, just so it feels natural. Bit more of that blend. Leaving openings of the sand still. Again, if you get a little bit toothy, it's not a bad thing. And we can also build a lot of highlights on top of this a little bit later on. So do plan to brighten it a little bit when you're in the mixing process. There we go. I like that. Again, I didn't expand on this area to a great degree initially because I wanted to feel it out. And I think it's working quite well. So we can kind of build up here more. You see how this all essentially has this shadow from the wave? Looks a lot darker. The more we add these layers, the more we can get some real hue. And we want a bit more full water right under the wave than we have through here. So we will block that in fully. And then we get to the point where it starts to move up the wave. So I'm going to change the direction of my brush to just work upwards on the same slant that the wave will. There we go. We'll move out slightly, but we do need to start changing our hue as we get to this side because we're no longer in that shadow. So back to the titanium white. Actually, we'll mix that up here. Grab a little bit of that. It should be similar to what we have down here. We'll do a test. Looks good. Might be a little bit bright. Grab a bit more. Make sure it's nice and watery, semi-transparent, to a point. Now we can resume what we were doing through there with a more detail-oriented brush. Like that. I'm also going to work on the transition between these two. We're doing a wet into dry blend here, but you can do wet into wet if you want to remix the previous color. I just like how it looks like it's building on top of it. Gives it a bit of a highlight, a little bit of extra depth. See that? Lots of little taps as well as drags. Again, up here we start moving into the wave. And I'm just applying this to the tops of all of the protruding pieces of foam. There we go. Starting to come together. Still looks a little awkward. Still building the foundation of the painting, no doubt, but it is coming. Now, back to more of that fairly bright foam. Building up their second layers. And expanding upwards. You can see how these lines are also getting smaller, thinner as you move up. Looking at the reference photo for a lot of it, looking at my drawing for a lot of it, also just kind of letting it free flow for a lot of it. There's a lot happening in terms of decision making, pulling from pieces I like, but also making my own and just trying to find that right balance. Also, when we get farther into the distance, we get a lot more horizontal little taps rather than ones that work in more unique verticals. And that's essentially because perspective is pushing those lines together and making it more difficult for us to visually interpret the movements that are occurring. The foam itself isn't really changing, but the way we visually see it is. And then up here, we have a lot of foam. We're going to have a bit of a reaction from the wave, which is going to be crashing down here. So we'll start with that movement, creating all of these little waves, all of these reactions essentially. I'm adding emphasis highlight, emphasis to the right hand side of a lot of these, because we essentially had the light on a lot of the right hand side of our clouds. So when I'm building up my foam, if I want one side to be a bit brighter, it's the right hand side, not the left hand side, and that's where I'll also just add a bit more volume. And then in this middle area, we're actually going to cover the majority of it with foam. Like so, until we get back towards the wave that will be right there. It's all very thin. Let's grab some extra titanium white. Build up the center area a little bit. Work it back, trying to pull from the protruding sides and work their way up. So that way we can establish how volume is working towards the top. See that? Very intentional. Lots of movements following each other. We're kind of creating all these intricate little shapes in between. There we go. This has been one long clip. We've been painting foam for quite some time. But it's very cathartic. And this brush does make it easy. Getting just the right amount of detail. So now we'll take a bit of a step back here and mix an abundance of paint, yet again using the larger flat-headed brush, starting with our titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, mix that together, hint of our turquoise green, do a little test, looks great, maybe slightly more titanium white, which will thicken it to a greater degree. Slightly more turquoise green because the titanium white will desaturate it. And that looks perfect. So, now back to the smaller flat-headed brush. Again, this one is a 3. We need to start building up some of the very thin applications, very specifically in the back here. And I want you to see from a distance just how my brush is kind of tapping and dancing throughout this. We're essentially at a point where it's almost entirely horizontal. All right? But when we get towards a bit of a wave back here, it's going to move up to the left. And then as we move up another wave, it starts to create this transition. This is something that I'd recommend painting from a little bit of a distance if you can. You can hold your brush farther back like this if it helps. But that way you get that larger perspective, because it's a very detailed area and it's easy to get very caught up in the minute portions of what you're doing, when realistically it's the larger flow which is going to make a much bigger impact. So that's what we're paying attention to in here. There we are. Now we can continue moving this forward. I'm applying these highlights to the tops of all of my previous applications. It doesn't need to be as wide as all of the previous applications, because if we have that slightly darker, slightly more transparent bottom, it just gives it more depth. Here you can see really playing with these lines. It almost looks like veins or the bodies of trees, stems, in these little spin-off areas. And I started with a very minimal amount and then built up over time. Now I'm going back up to the top here because I worked with it. I said, okay, I don't want to overdo this. I'll move elsewhere for the time being. I did, and then I said, okay, you know what? I've had time to digest. I can move back up. And then once we get to here, again, it expands, gets a lot wider. Building up the center areas, the tops. And we will be switching to another brush to continue a lot of this, but we're not quite there yet. There's just so much we can do with this technique and application. Lots of little bumps, lots of areas of foam that are rising. You can see there's a great contrast through this because we used more of that blue, a bit more Mars black in the mix. There we go. Let's go with something much brighter. Build on the foreground a little bit. Start creating some depth in here. Typically starting with the edges that protrude, the tops of them, and then building that out into a top up here. There we go. Definitely creating a lot more depth. Doing a slight blend down. I don't really want any truly hard edges, so there's a lot of softening once that paint is applied. Now, because we are working with acrylics and they're so thin, as you can see here, despite all of those applications, they're very transparent now, and I don't have them sticking out and being opaque to the degree I'd like. So here, I'm going back in with that same flat-headed brush. It's a 3. I have a lot of pigment on my brush. I don't have much water this time because I don't need to define new areas loosely. I'm just building highlight onto pre-existing areas I know need it. So here you can see I'm going into the tops of all of the markings we just made from a distance, at least here in the backing area, and I'm starting to fill those in with this. I'm going to go back and grab more paint. Again, not grabbing water this time, because I want this application to be much more thick rather than diluted. And it'll make a big difference. Look at that in comparison to that, right? That is the difference of layers. That's a little bit of time, that's a little bit of patience. That's all of it paying off. There we go. I like that. Also, something you'll probably hear me say a lot as I go through these paintings is I like that. And I say that in reference to things that I am doing. And I recognize, because someone commented on it the other day, that that might sound a little strange. As if we're giving ourselves compliments. But honestly, I think that's a good thing in painting. I think that there are so many awkward stages that when you finally get it, when it starts turning into what you want, give yourself that pat on the back. Let yourself know you're starting to accomplish what you really set out to do. Because you had to put a lot of time and effort, thought, care into what you're doing, and it's okay to take pride in that. I also definitely, to a point, disassociate with a lot of the individual mark making that I make. I think that when the painting is done, that it resonates, and it's a part of me and that which I put out there. But the individual strokes in the painting process itself is so technical that I feel like I'm almost working together with just painting theory. And when I am somewhat self-congratulatory, I'm in a weird way congratulatory towards the painting process and the techniques that I've learned from other people or just trying things. So it's kind of this, in my head anyway, more communal congratulations, I suppose. But I did just want to note that it's okay to take pride in that which you've made. It's okay to give yourself that pat on the back And again, it's probably actually pretty healthy to do so once in a while in these creative projects. There we go. We have a lot of depth moving out through this area. It's not finished, but with each application, we get a little bit closer. Here, just expanding on the parts that protrude. There we go. And this is why we very purposefully didn't go in with the brightest pigment initially, so that we could build these highlights and make something with a lot more depth. It's quite a bit in that unique realm. Lots of little taps in here when I start to run out of paint. There we go. Don't want to do too much in here because again, this is where we have the shadows. We can do a little bit more. Now what we're going to do is start working on the larger wave towards the foreground right here. I'm going to do the mixing for it with the larger flat brush. It's worth noting the color that we want to start this with is a base layer, and it's quite similar to the darker blue that we have in the back through here. So we'll start with a little bit of Mars Black, not too much because it really isn't that dark. Then I'm going to grab, for the first time, an equal mixture, ultramarine blue and turquoise green. Because we essentially have this in the midground, where the foreground is ultramarine blue, the background is the turquoise green. So we need a combination of the two. We'll grab some titanium white, brighten that up. I'll do a little test on the reference photo. That looks really nice. Do a little test here. And it looks a little bit too dark, admittedly, on the canvas, so I'll brighten it up slightly more. But it'll give us a lot of room to build, which is nice. So, that brush is down. The smaller flathead is up. Grab that pigment. And I'm going to apply this towards the foam in the bottom. And the shadows that surround it. We'll be applying brighter foam to almost all of this, but I essentially want that bottom to be a bit speckled. As you can see, there's a lot of tapping. And then I want it to drag up and speckle yet again as if the water is splashing. And we don't bring it up as far as we know we're going to want it, because we don't have to cover all of it later on. But we're essentially doing a practice round for the highlighted areas of highlight. The highlighted areas of highlight. It sounds redundant, but there are non-highlighted areas of highlight. So, it is something to consider. And it'll probably look a little odd because we're painting this very dark water that is a splash over essentially a brown, which is not a color one would associate with water, but it's one of those things where we trust the process and eventually we get what we really want. Also, as I start to really run out of paint, I'm just bringing this down, doing a little bit of a blend. Let's get you a bit closer. Now here we are again, grabbing more of that same pigment. We're going to have a lot of it over here. And then we'll do that blend down into our pre-existing markings. Gets much more horizontal, where up here it's kind of building on these larger slants. Lots of movement within this area, lots of splashing. If your blue changes a little bit because you have to remix, that's also not a bad thing through here. Just gives it a good eclectic look. We're already working with a new blue essentially because it's our first time blending the ultramarine and the turquoise green. Almost looks abstract at this point, which isn't a bad thing. Just work a couple little lines up and down. See that we're following the curvature of the wave. And just a soft little wash here. Give it a bit more blue, but don't disrupt a lot of that framework that we have for the actual shadows and foam. Just find little areas to interject it that are slightly farther out so that we have the most natural of transitions possible. And we can add highlight to the tops of these as well, in the same way that we will for the majority of this. That said, I really like the base layer. I think it's almost done. I think it's almost thick enough. There we go. Good. So, from there, it's time to make a little bit of a change. We're going back to this brush, which as you can see is very much not clean. So I'm going to clean it right now so that we can mix a brand new pigment. And my water admittedly is pretty blue right now, so this isn't going to get perfectly clean, but I do want a hint of blue in what we do next, so it's okay. We're going to essentially make what we have here, but just a little bit darker and maybe slightly more saturated with our turquoise green. Just a hint of Mars black. This is something I want to be able to build on, so it needs to have room to get brighter. And now we switch back to our rigger brush, which is a 1. Because it's time for the real detail. Now, something I like to do is find form first. So I'm just going to work this around very definitive areas of the splashing water. And you can see that I'm doing it through little taps and drags as if it's getting that real explosive launch from pressure and impact being flung. And I'm trying to follow the general movements of the wave, starting with the edges, but I'm not painting them like edges because we're not filling in every area of the edge, we're just working alongside it. But it's important to have quite a lot of little openings in there. Starting by looking fairly sparse, but it's another one of those subjects where initially you want to go in with the less is more attitude, and you build up over time. So, lots of taps here, building into those highlights, assessing form, I'm going to take a little break from that area. I know it's not done, but I want to see how it balances this area, so I'm just going to move to the left. There's quite a big splash right here. And I like this one because it covers this wave, midground. It covers this wave, which is the mid to background, and it's also going on top of the actual background in that landmass. So it's one of those things where it's creating a lot of depth by association with all that it works on top of. Important. Important, important. There we go. Now, the risk we run is right here. It looks like we have this little block, which we don't want. We need a great deal of randomization, and we need unique shapes. And then down here, we're going to have another set of splashes, and these are going to have much more unique follow through. As you can see, I'm really moving the brush with elongated strokes, unlike up here. And then it's meeting in the middle through this. But it's essentially visually a series of abstract shapes. And I'm trying to just add as much flair to my strokes as I can as I look up the reference photo. And then we can also build that down here. Again, work on top of the shadows that we implemented. That way we can bring them back into the context of the foam. This is one of those subjects where I know you're watching and you're thinking, is he is he going to make it look like something? But I'd like to remind you that you have seen the thumbnail. So you do actually know what this turns out into. And I have faith that we're going to make it pretty good. Going to grab more of this. There's a lot of splashing towards the top on the horizon of this wave initially, but then it also works its way forward. Really trying to make this wave look unique and have eclectic movements. A lot of the brush marks in the base layer moved on this trajectory, this arc. We'll complement that. Again, these are all just base layers. It can get a lot brighter. We can add volume. We can have depth. We're going to add additional texture with a different brush. Right now, though, we're just finding our base, our movements. As I step back, I realize that it's too hyper-focused on detail. We were doing all of these individual specific marks that are so unique and separate that they don't work together as a whole yet, and that can be a casualty. That can be a negative effect brought on by being too close to the canvas. So I'm taking the camera back. I myself am standing farther back we're going to go in with the same pigment, and I'm going to start making a much larger set of marks using the rigger brush to bring a lot of this together and make something much more uniform. Already, it's better. Already. I'm actually really glad that happened. That's a good lesson. And, as I always like to say, a great lesson is typically much more valuable than a great painting. So even if you mess up your painting, but you learn something really important, it was probably worth messing up the painting. Because the amount of paintings it can positively impact in the future is just so valuable. Which is just a thought process I'd like to recommend you keep in your head as you work through painting so that you're not afraid to take risks and chances. Because often, even if those things turn out not exactly how you want, they help you learn a lot. They help you grow. And that's what's most important. With really most everything. Okay, starting to get somewhere. I like it. Lots of these markings right up here. Looks good. I want a bit of a darker variant. Not significantly so, but we'll work some Mars Black into this larger mixture. And some Ultramarine blue. No, Turquoise blue. Could be both. Let's lean on Turquoise though. Just create something with a little more saturation and value. Bit of a transitionary pigment down into the darker area. And we can also slowly work in that ultramarine blue. I think this is working out quite nice. Okay, so now that we've reestablished the actual movements within the wave and we've kind of started solidifying larger pieces rather than just hyper-focusing on details that don't really fit together yet, we can actually proceed to add details that will work well within the piece. So, back to the 1-inch flat, grabbing a lot of titanium white. We're going to make probably the brightest mixture we've had since the actual sky. So, with this, I'm going to need to find a new spot on my palette. This is all dry, we'll go there. I'm going to grab the smallest hint of our turquoise, smallest hint of our ultramarine because we have the sky reflecting on it. Smallest hint of Mars Black. You can see I'm taking off the excesses. And that is a beautiful pigment. Very similar to what we had there. Switch over to the rigger. Grab some of this pigment. And now we can start true highlights. Going to begin at the top of this right here. This is where we actually began the wave. It's a place I personally find quite comfortable to begin. And we'll start bringing it down, but only slightly. Because everything below it, while quite bright, can act as a little bit of a shadow and create that depth. So we're not going over everything we've done, just the areas that really stand out and protrude that we want to have real notice of. This is for the real crashes. That looks nice. Let's head over here. Not going to do too much, with the exception of what's really on the top. There we go. Now, back up here. Highlight some of these drops. Easy. Very good. We're still bouncing around a lot. I have a lot of water on my brush, so I think I'm actually going to thicken this up with a bit more pigment and titanium white. And you can see the difference. This also isn't the final detail for the water here. We also have waves to do over there. So, it's starting to look good, but we are far from finished. You can see how it's really just jumping over what we have here. Just kind of feeling the motions, seeing if I need to exaggerate or calm anything, and I feel like I need to exaggerate this area right here. Definitely the call. Also, again, be mindful to not add these highlights all the way through the bottom. It'll look a lot better if they are unique to the top. And we have to build them a couple of times because we are working with acrylics, and even when we're not working with a lot of water, they are still going to be semi-transparent to a point and show through the darker layers underneath. So we need to make those underneath layers brighter through layering. Just as we're doing. Now we are going to take a break from the wave in the foreground and work on one in the mid to background right here. I'm going in with the flat-headed brush, as you can see. Again, it's a 3. Now for this, I actually want to start with a little bit of a darker pigment than what we have right there. So I'm going to mix on top of what we used for it, and we're going to go with a little bit more Mars black in that mix. We still need titanium white. Quite a bit of it, as you can see, but we do want darker. And with this, we're going to build a shadow for the wave. So I'm not going to get the very top because that is going to get light. And then I'll work it down in strokes that work like this until they get horizontal, so they match what we have here, essentially. And this way, it can look like the wave is swooping down, like that. We have some good dynamic motion. We can also take this pigment and work it into the waves up here a little bit. It isn't necessary, but it can look fairly good. That said, that's really all we're going to do for the actual shadow portion. So we can wait for it to dry, or we can work wet into wet and just recognize that the highlights that we apply will be slightly less highlighted and we'll have to do slightly more layering. I'm great with that. So what I'm going to do is from here, I'm going to continue working with this pigment, brightening it up. Not too substantially, but enough that it'll make a difference. And then I'll work that on top of the wave. And then with the corner of the brush, I'll do all of these little taps as I work my way across. And then we'll have it dissipate as we move over here. And we want this to work its way down the edge of this primary shadow. And it's a bit farther away, so this one has a lot of detail, this one will not. That said, we need to brighten now. Additional titanium white, very simple. Same process, we go to the top, we line that edge, we do taps with rotations. Also, almost all of the rotations are occurring in the air, they're not happening once the brush touches the canvas. Because I don't want a smudge, I just want a different marking. And we'll work that down here. There we go. Let's get a little bit more of a swoop. Brighten it. It's working quite nice for wet into wet. It's not being too stubborn. I don't want to brighten this to the point that we have over here because I don't want it to become distracting, but it definitely needs variance and depth. Things we will achieve through the progressive increase of value. See it. There's a little bit of a movement up there. And I think one more iteration of this and we should be free to move on to the next step. Very good. Very good. Like that. Now I also want some slight highlights and movements within this. So we're going to go back to the original mixture but make it slightly brighter this time. So with the first wave we went for a darker pigment to build the shadow. This time we're actually building it up. We'll do a little test over here. That's perfect. And I'm just going to add a couple of these little streaks in to imply the movement of water. Try to get darker areas in between. And very simple process right there. Now we get to have some fun with the final brush of the set, but before we do, we need to mix a pigment, and that is going to be extremely bright. We'll do it up here, starting with titanium white. We'll grab the smallest hint of our turquoise green and Mars black, and I do mean the smallest hint. This should be the brightest pigment we've mixed to this point. I can see it in comparison to that of the brighter clouds. We have what we want. I'll put that brush down. I will pick up, yet again for the first time, our fan brush. And this is it's a stiff bristled fan brush, but it's not exceedingly stiff, so if you get it wet, the bristles will condense to be more like that of a soft bristled fan brush. So you can get 5 or 6 markings, or you can get 50, like what we have here. And what we're going to do is we'll pick up our pigment. We're not adding any water to this brush right now. And then for the splashing, I'm going to find the angle in which I want to really pronounce it. And then I will tap that in on the axis of the splash. There we go. I'll get you a bit closer though. So yet again, we get a little bit of paint on both sides, but not too much paint. You can see all of the bristles are still fairly individualized. Now, Let's work on this back one here. Just give that a little bit of that jumping water. It's going to give it some extra depth because we're working with a new value. It's going to give it a sharper detail than what we could have achieved with the other brushes. We can soften some of it with our finger while keeping other areas sharper to kind of move in and out of focus, as if you're working with a camera. Now here, we have a lot splashing up. Again, being very mindful of how my brush is rotating. Go back. It's going to make it much more lively. Not adding too much at a time. Like with everything else, despite the fact that it's fun, we are approaching with caution. Again, doing this from a bit of a distance so that we don't hyper focus on the details like we did initially with the wave, because that is definitely not the way to get it the way we really want it to look. We need to work from a bit of a distance. Working their splashes through the top. A little bit down here, but not too much. Don't want to overdo it in that area. Then it comes down into here. It's a lot of little splashes. A little bit more through this. Have to be careful and mindful of the shadows. Much more natural in there, isn't it? This is where it all starts coming together. It's a lovely technique that we have to put 2 hours in at least beforehand, before we get the payoff of. But again, I think it just makes it more special, right? You feel like you earn it at this point. Add a little bit of this like way up here. I think that's fun. Much more lively. Then we can add a little bit of it into this area, but I'm also going to start tapping the detail throughout the bottom area here. I'm also going to start trying to talk in sentences again rather than individual words. Apologies. One of those things where you just get really wrapped up in the process and kind of constantly processing to the point where you can say a singular word at a time, apparently. I do want to be careful of not instigating too much pattern down here though. So in that case, I'm not pressing the entirety of the brush into the canvas. I'm just using a corner or an edge. That way I get 5 to 10 markings rather than 15 to 30, maybe 50 if the bristles are all really not condensed at that point. This is going to give us a much better look. And I really like it when I start to run out of paint and you just get that faint impression of it. Be careful with it up here though, because there are a lot of shadows. We can make more and larger markings towards the foreground. We We can make some in the foam towards the top. Give that foam texture rather than a smooth brush stroke. Now, yet again, we'll get a little closer. Grab that nice bright pigment with our fan brush. Apply it to the tops predominantly of the foam, trying to get as many markings as we can, but still keeping the contrast between the initial color behind it and this. So we're essentially just going for a fully speckled effect. And we need that initial color to show through on these, in between these taps, so that we get the depth within the foam. There we go. And now we'll add a couple up here. Again, being careful of that shadowy area. But I'll also, now that I'm starting to run out, just tap it throughout the watery sand, because all of the sand is slightly covered by water. And just incorporating the hints of foam as we are is a really nice look. We don't want to overdo it, so it's one of those things where you should apply it, take a couple steps back, take your time, and then move back in. But it really does add up. We'll do a little bit more up here. Make sure it's nice and cohesive. Blend it in. Not through a smooth blend, but through a pattern that connects. Maybe a little bit more to the top. You know me with painting. Never really done any subject. We're always going back and looking for that improvement. And you know what? I almost always find it, because as you paint, you learn. You get better, and then you can go back and you can reincorporate to a greater degree than you initially did. There we go. Now, another detail we are yet to incorporate is more of these lines through here, but done with the rigger brush, because previously we did so with the flathead, both of them, and this will give us a lot more control, a lot more detail, and now I feel like we have everything else in place so we can apply it while knowing that we're not going to overdo it, right? So with that, we're going to grab some of our titanium white and we'll mix up something fairly similar to what we have right here on the palette. It's really that bright but desaturated blue. A little bit of the ultramarine because we're closer to us, right? Hint of Mars black to desaturate it, but we do need to keep it fairly bright. I will make my brush nice and damp, clean it off, that way we don't have the excess pigment. And again, this can be a little bit more semi-transparent. This is where we start recombining areas and bringing them together. I did stray away a little bit from the reference photo, but again, as always, if you'd like help with the drawing process, the traceable will be up over on Patreon. There's a link to that in the video description. You can also find the reference photo for color matching. Up there you can also get access to all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into it. We have a private Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces. You can also get access to that. But what I really want to mention here and now is this was the first full demo with the finalized brush set. I've been using prototypes for the majority of this year on the lessons that you've watched me make, but this is the very first one with this set. These are the results that we were able to render, and this brush set is dropping tomorrow. Be here 11 a.m. Eastern time zone, and that is when the brushes will finally go live on the Craftamo website, and you will be able to pick up your version of this 5-piece brush set, which again has a very customized fan brush that honestly I love, because I used to always have to use 2 or 3 and jump between them, but this one makes it so that I don't have to do that. If I want to use a fan brush as a softer fan brush, I just add a little bit of water. If I wanted to hold its form and get that really sharp look, we can do that as well. If you watched the unboxing video, you also know that the rigger brush, what I'm currently using right here, I had the bristles extended quite a bit so that it can pick up a lot of water, which is nice for when we want to make a great deal of strokes. And I extended the bristles so that if we pressed in harder, we could get some nice blends and larger applications, so it's a bit more versatile as well. Again, there's also the Filbert and both flatheads. We used all of the brushes in this lesson. I'm incredibly proud of this brush set. I love that the first lesson we did with it turned out just like this. It's also worth noting, again, one of the primary reasons I decided to work with the brand Craftamo, despite not really doing sponsorships on this channel. They came to me and they noted, we make cruelty-free vegan brushes. I am someone who very much avoids buying real leather. I don't eat meat. I am a just big fan of being as unintrusive to other life as I can be. Obviously not perfect, and I'm not saying you have to do all of this as well, but if it's something that also matters to you, then I think that it's a fantastic brand to support, to buy from. The brushes, as you can see, work some real magic, and I've never worked with a company that I am more proud to be in connection with and make something. They let me fully customize the brush set, the box, the color, how the actual brushes and the bristles work. I mean, it's been quite the project that I'm really proud of. But again, August 28th, Sunday, tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, this set comes out. You'll be able to find a link to it in the description. If you are watching this video after that, you can go and you can buy them, but they are very limited. We didn't make that many. So if you really want to ensure that you get one and don't risk them selling out, there's also a link in the description right now to the Craftamo website where you can find this product. It's you can put in your email to get an update as soon as it drops so that you can get in just from an easy link in your email. So you can go and do that. But again, link will be in the description to where the set is going to be on Sunday. And if you're watching it after Sunday, that link is where it is. So nice and easy. And you know what I'm doing? I'm doing that same thing that I do at every end of a painting. I can't put my brush down. I just enjoy it too much. And then these videos end up being 20 minutes longer. And the painting gets better, but only marginally. But hey, it's a sign you're doing the right thing, eh? When you love it, when you can't put that brush down, And there's always so much to do with these paintings. But with you don't have to make a YouTube video. You don't have to teach it. So if you want, you could spend 20 hours perfecting this. And you know what? I think you get a pretty amazing piece. Don't ever feel like you have to finish a painting in an hour or two. Don't ever feel like you have to finish a painting in 20 hours. Whatever comes natural, whatever you enjoy, whatever fits into your life, whatever you find cathartic, and all of that's okay. So much of this process is subjective. We all get different things out of it, and I hope you feel like you learned a lot. I hope you feel like you had a lot of fun. I hope you feel inspired. And I'm really excited to share, again, this brush set with you. So that is the painting for today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this. I always really just appreciate when people make it to the end of these. I think statistically only 13% of people do, so if you are one of them, congratulations on being one of the very dedicated few. And I always like to include a little keyword at the end of these videos. That way it's a little badge of honor. It's a subtle way of saying, hey, I made it to the end, without saying, hey, I made it to the end. And today, instead of doing a keyword, I think I just want you to leave in the comments what your favorite brush to work with is. The thing that is most cathartic, you feel like you pick it up and you're just going to do something great. It's a good thing to think about, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts. So I guess I will see you tomorrow, as I'll be posting on all of the social media platforms that I have about the release of the brush set. But I hope you loved this, and I will start working on something new because I'm excited and I just want to keep painting. So there we go. You have a lovely day, and I'll see you soon. Stay creative.